Could the seed oils be the primary cause of the diseases of civilization?
This video is going to show you why you need to be adding sesame oil to your diet, why you should be cooking with sesame oil.
Those two components of your vegetable seed oils are actually very pro-inflammatory.
Is the vegan oil-free diet beneficial for health or just another form of extreme restrictive eating?
Maybe even toxic. Vegetable oil.
Remember, oils are rancid products. They oxidize really easily. They go rancid and bad.
But wait, I thought carbs made us fat. No, this is what I'm saying. Carbohydrates don't make you fat, you guys. Linoleic acid makes you fat.
So in summary, Black Seed pretty much handles about every single problem that you may experience.
What have your comments gotten me into? Hey, Chris, they said, can you clarify the confusion around seed oils? It will be fun, they said. I don't even have a horse in this race because whatever the answer, I'm fine with it. Although hummus is a little more tasty with some olive oil in it, am I right? And so are these delicious tamales that I get from the farmer's market that my dog wants. But I can deal if there's something to the current panic over seed oils because we have plenty of delicious oil-free recipes. So here's the lay of the land. On the scale of plant-free to animal-free, both camps found something to agree on. No processed foods. Most of the leading lights in both camps consider oils to be processed and bad for health. But both diets have close cousins that don't agree. The traditional Mediterranean diet, the way it was 50 years ago before so much processed food and meat entered the picture, leans heavily into plants, and they have always believed olive oil is healthy. The ancestral diets lean into meat, and they usually believe coconut, olive, and sesame seed oils are healthy. I don't know how our hunter-gatherer ancestors imported coconut oil, but whatever. Vegans and carnivores have other cousins too, and those cousins seem to stick together in their beliefs. Another fascinating view of the landscape is who is getting views on social media versus how much science they do. The influencers without scientific backgrounds like YouTubers Joe Rogan and What I've Learned are super popular. A few journalists are not far behind, and so are some doctors who devote a lot of time to social media influencing. Way, way, way down the popularity curve are nutrition scientists who spend their days actually doing science. The occasional exception is one who makes it big on the TED stage, but that's usually a one-speech affair. So what if we try to cut through the fog by taking the road less traveled and hear from scientists way down at the bottom of the popularity curve and see if that makes all the difference? In this episode, we'll consider the high meat eaters' beliefs first, then the keto community, then Mediterranean, and finally the vegans. We'll see if scientists can be the candle in the dark that Carl Sagan admired, so we can end with a simple, compelling conclusion. Let's start with a journalist and a social media doctor up the popularity curve who are known for promoting animal foods.
Vegetable oils, oils of any kind, were really not used for human consumption. They were used for industrial machinery as lubricants. I mean, first it was really whale oil from the 1820s to the 1860s. And then when we killed all the whales, we moved over to cottonseed oil.
There was no such thing as a seed oil before 1870.
And here's a scientist from the bottom of the popularity curve, Dorothea Betagian. She points out sesame oil goes back millennia and was prominent in diets well before the birth of Christ. Here's just one passage from the paper. Medieval Arabian culinary use. Sesame oil was such a prominent ingredient that it had its own name, sharaj. I probably butchered that pronunciation. It was the preferred cooking fat for chicken and the usual fat in making pastries and sweetmeats. It was also a flavoring stirred into pudding. 3 archaeologists wrote this beautiful book on olive oil in the Holy Land. It was one of the earliest and biggest industries in Israel with presses all over the country. Did you know they found casks of olive oil in Israel that are 8,000 years old?
They're not natural. These are the natural fats that humans ate for millennia.
One factor in the use of plant oils has been the dietary tradition of Jews, Hindus, and Muslims who have traditionally frowned on the use of animal fats. Oreo famously spent millions of dollars kosherizing Oreos in the mid-1990s, and that meant getting the lard out. As you can see, I have an unnatural interest in food history.
Honey, how many books on food history does one man need? And half of yours are on Kindle. Do you have a book problem?
Yes, I do. Speaking of my Kindle, I have cookbooks from colonial and Civil War era America, and here's a cookbook from the time of Julian of Norwich in the late 1300s. Here's an American recipe for French slaw in 1850. To 1 pint of the cut cabbage, have 3 eggs boiled hard, mash the yolks with a spoon, and add gradually 1 wine glassful of oil. Then pour in 1 wine glass of vinegar, 1 teaspoonful of common mustard, or a dessert spoonful of French mustard, salt, and cayenne pepper to taste. They typically used peanut, sunflower, or olive oil. Their mayonnaise recipes were full of it. This thick book by 3 food history professors points out that the staples of the Greeks and Romans were bread, wine, and oil. By the way, there's a perception that we in the 2000s are more obsessed and confused by diet than our ancestors were. But when you read these books, you find out that people were always that way. For example, here's a carnivore book from 1907 during a period when that diet rose to popularity, fueled in part by Teddy Roosevelt. I got a really big kick out of reading the preface. This subject was never so widely studied, and apparently never were there so many peculiar and clashing foodal ideas as now. One belief from previous centuries we can learn from is they thought variety was the key to health. Here's a recipe for salad from the 1300s. Parsley, sage, green beans, scallions, lettuce, leeks, spinach, mint, green onions, fennel, rosemary, purslane, watercress, primrose, and violets. You may not be able to find all these ingredients, but do what you can. Mix them well with oil, vinegar, and salt. Let's try another point.
Because heart disease really only was rare until the late 1920s.
Here's what the scientists say. They performed CT scans on 137 mummies from across 4 continents and found artery plaque in every single population studied, from pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers in the Aleutian Islands to the ancient Puebloans of the southwestern United States. But Chris, you say, what about when social media influencers do reference scientific studies?
Back in the 1960s, Ivan France conducted a meticulously controlled study that would shed light on what actually happens when people cut out saturated fats and eat polyunsaturated vegetable fats instead. The study, which would be called the Minnesota Coronary Survey, took years to set up and had more than 9,000 research subjects. Since people were living in institutions, they could control exactly what the people ate.
To this day, it stands as one of the most rigorous diet trials ever conducted. So what does the Minnesota study show? The patients on the vegetable oil diet did end up with lower cholesterol than the people who ate food cooked with animal fats. But the vegetable oil people didn't live longer.
That study generated sensational headlines. The data for it was never published, and it was found in a basement 5 decades later, and it seemed to overturn the prevailing theory about fats. The lead scientist for that study worked at the University of Minnesota with one of the most famous nutrition scientists ever, Ancel Keys, the man credited with popularizing the Mediterranean diet and associating saturated fat with heart disease. And yet this study was suppressed, so the story goes, because it didn't support the hypothesis of Ancel Keys. And the study was a blinded, randomized control trial considered the gold standard of evidence, conducted at a unique point in history when you could pull off a trial like that on humans in the 60s. I was hoping I would never have to discuss this trial because it takes me to a very dark place. It was conducted in 6 mental institutions and a nursing home. It turns out my beautiful mom, whom I adored, was struck with schizophrenia at 35 and confined to a mental hospital over and over. My mom and I lived for years on the streets of Oakland when I should have been going to elementary school. You wouldn't think it could happen to a child or to a woman who got a master's degree in organic chemistry from Cornell, but it happened to us. I gave a TEDx talk about it that wrecked me for a while, and if you'd like to know more, I'll link it in the description. I will never get over the tragedy that befell my mom, but I mention it because I think it gives me unique perspective on this study. But let's cheer up and see a couple animals. Oh, look, there's a cute little coyote. Well, hello guys. You want to come over and say hi?
I bet you boys caused the lady turkeys to swoon.
I believe one of the best things we can do to understand nutrition is to understand just a few simple things about how studies are designed. Otherwise, it's like driving through a thick fog. The first thing is that chronic diseases take a long time to develop, 20 years or more. And so studies have to be designed with that in mind. You can smoke for 20 years and look and feel great the whole time. Studies that involve mortality as an endpoint are the hardest because you have to track a large number of people for a very long time and know why they died. That makes randomized control trials the gold standard for short-term studies, almost impossible for long-term studies. You can't find a large group of people who are willing to change their diet and stick to it for the rest of their lives for your 50-year study. You can do that with drugs because people are willing to take a pill for the rest of their lives, like a statin. No one should take that to mean that you can't do great dietary studies on all-cause mortality over the decades, because we have at least a dozen great ones, including the one that helped us unravel the fact that smoking is unhealthy. Some of you are ready to comment that smoking is easier to study than diet is because it's not distributed among all our foods. Fair point. But we have other examples like trans fats where it took long-term studies to unravel the health effects, and we had no long-term randomized control trials to help us with that either. The second thing that helps immensely is when the study cohort, a fancy name for study participants, have several things in common to reduce confusing variables. For example, 2 of Harvard's studies involve nurses, which have similar socioeconomic backgrounds, which is a major determinant of health. That's what makes studies of populations like hunter-gatherers so difficult. It's hard to find enough of them to get good statistics. Their genetics and lifestyles are quite different than ours. Plus, they have a lot of survivorship bias because they were able to survive childbirth and infections and accidents without the medical care that most Western countries have. The Minnesota coronary experiment seemed like a great idea. They had a great team, they had a lot of money, and they put a lot of effort into the experimental design. They fed one set of patients high levels of corn oil by infusing their meat, milk, and cheese with it and removing some of the saturated fat from those foods. They replaced butter in the diet with a special soft margarine, which they probably didn't realize at the time had a form of trans fat, which was pretty damaging. But tragically, this study ran into the problem of cohort selection. They were in and out of the hospital, on and off the program, and struggling with cigarettes and alcohol and depression, which I know all too well about this cohort. I spoke to a great scientist who was very familiar with this study because he was there at the University of Minnesota at that time, also working under Ancel Keys on diet heart studies. It's Henry Blackburn. He's 97 and still publishing and looks great. Here's a photo he sent me last week of him holding his great-grandson. Last fall, we were communicating while he was out on his ski boat. He said factors outside the control of the investigators prevented them from getting meaningful results. He said one of the factors was the deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill at that time, a factor which I know all too well because that's how I ended up on the streets with my mom. The lead researcher on this paper gave an interview just before his death, and he said, "I didn't really start to feed the special diets until after the end of that 3-year feasibility study, and that was fatal to the project because during that time, these psychiatric drugs were developed and the patients were getting discharged right and left from these mental hospitals. That prevented me from getting a definitive answer." Dr. France eventually did publish about the study in 1989, and here it is. He said the average length of each hospital stay was 292 days. The average total time in the hospital was 384 days. He also bemoaned the fact that accidents and suicides confounded the data because biopsies didn't always reveal the cause of death. That's something I also know all too well because I lived with the wonderful mentally ill on the streets for so many years, and they suffer more than anyone should have to suffer. Henry is very strict with me about what I can and can't conclude from a study, which is one of the things I love about him. We both admire Dr. France for not trying to torture his data and try to squeeze out uncertain conclusions, but Henry was pretty distraught that this has become the subject of conspiracies 50 years later. There were 2 papers published in the British Medical Journal after recovering some of the raw data Dr. France kept in his basement. One took the point of view it was a good study on the basis that it was a randomized control trial, and because it brought into question the diet heart hypothesis, since more people died in the corn oil group than on their normal diet. The other paper observed that the data also showed fewer people died who had high blood pressure and who smoked. That paper also observed that only 595 participants were studied for more than a year, and 83% of the control group was lost to follow-up, so we're not actually sure how many of them died. As I listened to people who were so certain this trial was definitive because it contained the words randomized trial, a thought kept coming to my mind. I'll let these 2 weightlifting doctors say it because they seem to be very knowledgeable.
So what I'm getting at is like actual professionals and experts in the field are not arguing about this. It's only like the seed oil conspiracy theorists.
But let's see what the other groups say, because the vegans don't like oils either. Are they conspiracy theorists too? A group of journalists and doctors who are popular on social media and who favor low-carb diets produced the film Fat Fiction and had bold things to say.
And the number 1 inflammatory substance in the American diet is sugar. That's it.
They said Ancel Keys, who had enormous influence in nutrition science, showed a stunning chart in 1953.
He specifically looked at 6 countries around the world, and on the x-axis he plotted fat intake and on the y-axis coronary heart disease rates, and he found a straight line relationship.
But he chose 6 countries for that perfect correlation, and at the time there was data available for 22 countries.
And when you put in all of those countries, it just looked like a scatter plot. There was no clear relationship.
No correlation between fat and heart disease.
Bold statement. Another thing that helps immensely in understanding nutrition science is just a little understanding of statistics. Correlation has specific meaning and statisticians put a number on it.
A positive correlation indicates a positive relationship. A positive one would be very strong. This has a correlation of 0.4, which is still fairly positive. A correlation of 0 means there's absolutely no correlation whatsoever. And a negative correlation means there is a correlation, but it is in a negative direction.
So if that chart showed no correlation, it would not go up to the right. It would be flat.
He was criticized at the time by statisticians who said, you're obviously cherry picking your data.
The two statisticians she was referring to wrote this paper in 1957, and that's where Fat Fiction got the chart. Being good statisticians, they calculated the correlation and it came out to be 0.39, about the same as the charts we just saw. The paper also noted some countries on their chart, like Sri Lanka, Mexico, and France, had very questionable data. So what was their criticism of Keyes? It was that they also plotted mortality versus animal protein consumption, and the correlation was stronger, 0.465. So maybe it was the protein and not the fat? Wait, what? If the correlation with fat and mortality was like that, and with protein it was steeper, what does that mean? Does that mean consuming more protein and less fat increases mortality? Being good statisticians, they did more correlations and the answer became clear. When they separated the fat into animal and vegetable, the correlation rose to 0.557 for animal fat, much stronger, and minus 0.509 for vegetable fat, meaning consuming vegetable fat strongly reduced mortality. They also did it for protein, 0.608 for animal protein versus minus 0.483 for vegetable protein. Carbohydrate was also strong, minus 0.386. I assume that was because it was 1957 and the percent of carbs from ultra-processed foods was much lower back then. I read those numbers as meaning seed oils may not be poison because they were a significant portion of the vegetable fats people were consuming. France, for example, has long favored grapeseed oil. This is the paper Fat Fiction based their claims on, so why say there was no correlation between saturated fat and heart disease? And why no mention of the correlation with animal protein or the negative correlation with plant foods? This doesn't feel like conspiracy theory to me, it feels like industry influence. For example, the woman making many of the claims is Nina Teicholz. She runs the Nutrition Coalition, which is funded by a Texas hedge fund billionaire, and it sure looks like it's a front group for the beef industry. Its only activities are lobbying and PR. Nina takes a $144,000 salary according to public disclosures. I have read many books about the beef industry, and their playbook is to hire camera-ready moms like Nina for PR and to dodge questions about the health of red meat by saying, hey, look over there, seed oil. Oh, look over there, sugar. The two statisticians were careful to say the data available to them for the 22 countries was from the United Nations, and it was shaky, and their correlations could neither confirm or rule out the diet heart hypothesis. And that's exactly why Ansel Keys and Henry Blackburn and an international team of scientists set out to collect really good data over the next 50 years.
Keys was determined to prove himself right. He followed up with his famous 7-country study where he traveled to the countries cherry-picked from his graph.
You see what they did there? The 7-country study didn't choose Canada, Australia, England, or Wales. They went to 4 countries not on this chart, including Greece and Yugoslavia, which were not among the 22 countries that had cardiovascular data at the time. They had strong scientific reasons for their selections, which Keys describes in his very thorough book about the 7 countries study. They chose Finland because it had the highest heart attack rate in the world, and Japan had the lowest, which provided a 10-fold spread. They chose Greece for its known high-fat consumption from olive oil. They chose the 7 cohorts in Yugoslavia and Greece in part because there was no data about cardiovascular disease rates there, and they didn't want to be accused of cherry-picking. Little did they know that the internet would be invented 35 years later, which would take conspiracies to the next level. When Finland saw the early data, they swung into action by assigning a young scientist to address the problem, and seed oil played a central role. Ansel's early data showed olive oil did not cause heart disease, but animal fats did. In Finland, they couldn't grow olives, but they could grow canola, developed by Canadians. Canola oil means Canada oil, low acid. The Finns were eating thick slices of cheese slathered with butter, so superfit lumberjacks who looked the model of health were dying in their 30s of heart attacks. And over several decades, the Finns reduced their heart attack rates by 80% and increased life expectancy by 20 years. Note this wasn't just an observational study. They chose the North Karelia area as the intervention group and the rest of Finland as the control. When they saw how good the results were, they got all of Finland to consume more canola oil and less animal fat and thoroughly documented it all. So instead of the Minnesota coronary experiment, which involved a smallish number of people for a short period of time who were not very representative of us, the North Karelia project involved all of Finland for almost 50 years. The young scientist who headed the project is Pekka Puska, who received the World Heart Federation's Lifetime Achievement Award. He's at the bottom of the social media popularity chart too, but fortunately he let me interview him. Some of the commenters on that episode said he's a national hero in Finland, their version of David Attenborough. Pekka said they couldn't adopt a purely Mediterranean diet living in the frozen north as they do, so they came up with their own foods like berries, created their own food pyramid, coordinated with their neighbors, and called it the Nordic diet.
And that brings me to the Mediterranean diet, the most studied diet in the world. Walter Willett is a scientist low on the social popularity chart, but he wrote the standard textbook on large population studies. He realized no one had been able to get long-term randomized trials to work on diet.
In theory, you would do large randomized trials. Like you might randomize 20,000 people to either high trans fat or low trans fat diets and follow them for a few decades. Well, the trouble is, that study is going to be very, very hard, probably impossible to do, and now it would be unethical. And the few times that those very sort of super large studies have been tried, they haven't worked very well because people didn't stay on the diet they were assigned to.
So he and his colleagues decided the better design for mortality are called prospective cohorts. Prospective means you follow a population for a very long time.
The study design basically consists of questionnaires that go out every 2 years. They're used to update information about smoking and physical activity, find out who developed heart disease, who developed cancer. And along the way, we've collected toenail clippings that we use for trace element analyses and blood that we use for DNA analysis and biochemical analysis. And we've collected urine. Pretty much everything you could think of asking about, we've asked on these questionnaires. If somebody does report cancer or heart disease, we write to them, get permission to get their medical records. In the case of most cancers, we get permission to get the actual tumor tissue, and now we can do a lot analyzing that. About 90% of the women are still participating after about 40 years in the original Nurses' Health Study. So that's really what has made the study successful.
The reaction on social media to this form of epidemiology from people on social media who have no background in these kind of studies takes me to another dark place. I was an earth scientist for many years involved in water testing, and it was the same movie in that field, but with different actors. Testing would reveal an area where a company was polluting, and we'd see an increased frequency in childhood cancers or heavy metal poisoning. Armed with very sophisticated statistics, hard to say with my face so cold, epidemiologists would do their best to estimate probabilities and project trends. Distraught parents would see that data and become convinced their child's cancer was due to pollution. Company officials would hire the best lawyers money can buy to cast doubt on the scientists. There's a great movie about how this goes down called A Civil Action, starring John Travolta and Robert Duvall. Here's one of the lawyers talking to a company employee who's not sure what to believe.
Al, that water hasn't made anybody sick. Look, if I took 100 pennies, I threw them up in the air, about half of them would land heads and the other half tails, right? Now, if I looked around closely, I'd probably find some heads grouped together in a cluster. What does that mean? Does that mean anything?
Here's another one talking to the parents of victims to create doubt.
Do you have Teflon pans in your kitchen? Do you chew sugarless gum? Do you pump your own gas? Do you use hairspray? Do you use artificial sweeteners? Smoke cigarettes? Drink diet soda? Use tampons? Do you ever have your clothes dry clean? Do you have silver fillings in your teeth?
Many company employees end up siding with the company because of Upton Sinclair's famous quote, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it." Judges and juries rarely know anything about statistics, and anyway, the companies do a great job with their PR firms rallying support in the community, so the parents frequently lose in court and the children keep getting cancer. Oof, I'm sorry to harsh your day. The parallel with nutrition is eerie. The same arguments the lawyers used in a civil action are all over social media. Correlation is not causation. There are many things it could be. People can't remember what they consumed. Observational studies rank lower than clinical trials, so we can't conclude anything. But we have a big advantage in diet that we didn't have in earth science, which is we can do short-term randomized feeding trials to humans and see what happens to things like blood tests. They can't prove causation of heart attacks and death because they're too short-term, but they can show biological plausibility, and combined with long-term trials, they can increase the level of certainty. And that's exactly how groups of scientists like Walter figured out that trans fats are not cool. Epidemiologists are not idiots. They have very deep statistical knowledge that almost no doctors, nutritionists, or social media influencers have. They often have to infer causality, as they had to do with smoking and trans fats, and we always had to do in earth science. To infer whether Yosemite was formed by glaciers, we didn't have the luxury of having control Yosemites that we could observe over millions of years. We couldn't do clinical trials of solvents on children to prove that they increase rates of leukemia where companies dump solvents in the water table. But the reverse is absolutely true. You don't get causation without correlation.
Epidemiology only shows associations. And nutritional epidemiology is particularly fraught because it depends on people reporting what they ate.
Questionnaire design is fascinating. You know how you sign up for a music service and they ask you a few questions about artists and songs you like, and then they're able to create playlists automatically for you with surprising accuracy? That's because certain bands and songs are tells. The services can't exhaust you by asking too many questions, so they must infer using very powerful statistics involving a lot of people. Epidemiologists have studied questionnaire design for half a century, and they can score questions according to how predictive they are in discerning your diet. Here's some examples. You don't need to know how the number in the right column is derived, other than they take years and thousands of test subjects. The key thing is the larger the number, the better it predicts the differences between people's diets. So beef doesn't say much, but hamburger does. Chicken no skin is a bigger tell than chicken with skin. Epidemiologists are very aware of healthy user bias among people who participate in studies, and answers to these questions are tells for that too. The actual questionnaires look something like this to get the frequency of a given food item that people consume. They also know there's a big difference between conceptual and specific questionnaires. For example, you can easily answer what your general dietary pattern was over the last year, but you can't remember what you ate last Tuesday, am I right? If they don't ask you to fill them out too often, they can ask as many as 130 questions, as Harvard does, and most people are still willing to fill them out carefully for decades. Statistical analysis of questionnaires with huge participant bases, as Harvard gets, shows them to be surprisingly reliable among responsible cohorts like nurses and health professionals. Everyone on the internet can quote a hierarchy of evidence that looks like this and sound very informed. But for chronic disease, because it takes a long time to develop, randomized trials don't work and prospective cohorts are far better. You may think meta-analyses are even better, but I cringe every time I see one.
Meta-analyses are out of control and need additional layers of review. The problem is that anybody with an internet connection can do a meta-analysis.
If the Cochrane Library does it, great, but I agree with Walter that they are out of control because people who don't actually do studies or fully understand them think they can do meta-analyses. And the worst of them get the most press because they defy what we know, making them newsworthy. All of that was a long lead-in to a recent Harvard study about oils in the nurses and health professional cohorts. 90,000 participants over 28 years with 37,000 deaths carefully followed. Walter's at Harvard and he's a co-author of this paper. Here's what they found. Nutrition is always about comparing one food to another, and in this study they compared olive oil to margarine, butter, mayonnaise, other vegetable oils, and dairy fat. And the study is big enough to do it for various diseases. This is for substituting 10 grams of olive oil per day for those other fats. That's only 3/4 of a tablespoon. You can see there's a greater than 10% reduction in mortality for just that small amount of olive oil. And how does it compare to other oils? The confidence intervals aren't as tight with this comparison, but in total mortality it looks like a wash between olive oil and other oils. That surprised me. For cardiovascular disease, olive oil might not be quite as effective as canola oil.
Canola oil actually shows further reduction in like your blood lipids, blood cholesterol, even when it's replacing, not just when it's replacing saturated fats, but when it's replacing olive oil.
But it might be more effective in preserving your brain. This study is so big and carefully done, there is no way the vegan community can match it. So, checkmate vegans? I mean, there is the Dean Ornish coronary study, the first study to show you could actually reverse heart disease in humans. But as Walter points out, that was a small study of just 48 people who were already quite ill with heart disease, and there were other interventions like meditation.
So what about them vegans?
Instead of calling himself a vegan, Hugo decided that he was going to identify as, get ready for it, because it is a humdinger, plant positive. Oh, nice work, Hugo. Successfully sidestepped the wanker bullet there, didn't we?
Dean Ornish is a giant in the field who has not only shown how diet and lifestyle can improve heart disease, but also prostate cancer, depression, diabetes, and the expression of our genes. He doesn't fully prohibit olive and canola oils, but he promotes a very plant-dominant diet with only 10% of calories coming from fat, which doesn't leave much room for oils.
But I noticed one of his co-authors in their paper on telomere length versus lifestyle, the Nobel Prize winner Elizabeth Blackburn, went on to write a book recommending the Mediterranean diet. She recommends the little seaweed snacks that are roasted in olive oil. I don't like anecdotes, but here's one with real statistical power. The three men most responsible for the rise of the Mediterranean diet and the diet heart hypothesis are Ansel Keys, who lived to 100, Jerry Stamler, who recently passed at 102 and worked until the end, and Henry Blackburn, who ran the 7-country study for 50 years and looked so healthy at 97, I expect he'll live longer than Jerry did. The odds of an American man born in the early 1900s becoming a centenarian is about 1 in 10,000. Statisticians, what are the odds that all three men would achieve that? I asked Henry the other day, let me do some maths. Keys at 100, Stamler at 102, you at 110. What are the odds? Is it something the three of you were eating? He shot back, plus something our ancestors didn't eat? Fascinating. I definitely need to follow up on that. When great scientists disagree, what are you and I to do? We haven't devoted our lives to A-level research like they have, and yet for many meals we have to choose between them. Or do we? What if it's just a matter of context? The theme of this episode has been to hear from scientists who gave up a social media presence to actually do science full time. So I'll start with Gary Fraser for the context question. He runs the Adventist II study, and both he and the study are deeply respected by scientists. He eats a little dairy and some fish, but he has 9,000 vegans in his study and knows them well.
Our cohort had about 96,000 people. About 25,000 of them were black. We began by, first of all, dividing them to different kinds of dietary patterns. We had about 42,000 who were non-vegetarians, nearly half, but about 9,000 who were vegan. I'd like to think a little bit about the vegan diet, and these diets are very different. And you can see that the green lines are really quite unusual as compared to the others. If we look at fruit and vegetables, the vegans look rather different. Plant protein foods, no surprise, a similar kind of thing. Animal protein foods, exactly the opposite. So vegan diets really are quite dramatically different to others.
I think what he's saying is some vegans want to take things to the next level, which describes me because apparently as a child on the streets, I came down with rheumatic fever, which did crazy damage to my heart. And that caused several of my doctors to be alarmed, plus I inherited the genetic high cholesterol that took my father and sister, so I can't mess around. The vegan doctors who are most vocal about no oils are usually dealing with advanced heart disease like Caldwell Esselstyn, or diabetes like the two guys from the Mastering Diabetes program who I'll interview next week. Most of them say the studies are very conclusive about the health effects of substituting liquid oils for saturated fats, but it doesn't mean they're healthier than whole foods. Walter's context is to erect a big tent for the broader population, but I haven't heard him say that oils are superfoods, only that oils make superfoods like broccoli more palatable so you eat more of them. That game. I think what Walter is saying is that nutrition policy should change from this.
Just a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down.
To this.
Just a spoonful of olive oil helps the veggies go down.
Where is Julie Andrews when you need her? Walter and vegan scientists point out that some foods which are healthy for slender, active, healthy people no longer are when your health declines. Walter puts potatoes in that category, and many vegan scientists do the same with oils. For example, the vegan neurologists who have the best vegan recipes, the Sherzais, say, if you are a healthy person with a good body mass index, a little extra virgin olive oil dressing on your salad isn't going to hurt you. In fact, it will probably help you. But let's say we're talking about a man who's 50 years old, is overweight, and is pre-diabetic. In this case, we would want him to stay away from a lot of high-fat foods like oils. We feel that a diet can be healthy with or without the extra virgin olive oil depending on a person's baseline metabolic state. So I feel the two views are compatible. If Walter and Henry can get the masses to shift from saturated fats to liquid oils, huge win. Just look at the extraordinary success Pekka had in Finland. And when doctors like Ornish get patients with advanced disease, time to swap out the oils for healthier whole plant alternatives. Context. Stefan Guyenet is a good scientist with a good book who's concerned about seed oils for very good reasons. We consume them in ever-increasing quantity thanks to processed foods. Here's what he says on his blog. I feel the evidence behind the hypothesis that seed oils, corn, soybean, etc., promote obesity due to their linoleic acid, omega-6 fat, has largely collapsed. I think seed oils promote obesity because they're used to increase the reward/palatability value of processed food. But this would be equally applicable to animal fats and more saturated plant oils if they were used in the same foods. So what are those simple takeaways I promised at the beginning of the episode? I think they're: number one, oils in processed foods are the devil. Number two, liquid oils as a replacement for saturated fats and to help the veggies go down are awesome. And number three, people who carry extra pounds, have heart disease or diabetes, would benefit from finding a whole food replacement to even the liquid oils, such as grinding up flax seeds to put on your salad. Wow, thank you for hanging in this whole long way, but I have a bone to pick with a few of you. I made a loose statement a few episodes back about Clint Eastwood leaning into high plant diets, and you've been calling me out in the comment sections ever since. Well, it turns out when I picked up this Dean Ornish book for this episode, I looked in the endorsements, and there was Clint Eastwood himself. I've been following Dean Ornish's program for more than a decade, and I feel younger now than I did 10 years ago. Dr. Ornish's style of eating and living is always delicious and never boring.
If you're at a friend's house or a relative's house and they're using these cooking oils, you should really, for their benefit, just grab them and throw them in the garbage.
Without these seed oils, we would not have the burden of chronic disease that we do.
All right, let's answer the question. The best oils for weight loss are, Dr. Hyman?
Well, these two particularly are good oils. One is walnut oil, and the other is something you probably never heard of called black seed oil.
French fries is far worse than smoking, actually probably quite a lot of cigarettes. And the reason is, first of all, because of the fact that when we consume these oils,
that oil has been treated with Drano window washing acid, bleached and fried before it went in the bottle.
How is it that popular advice on cooking oil is not only different between different sources, but often completely contradictory?
A few weeks ago, I lost my mind and let people in the comments section talk me into wading into the edible oil controversy. I took the road less traveled to hear from scientists who spend their days actually doing science instead of the people who get the views by doing social media. I thought the scientists and I would get crushed on the socials after posting that episode for relying so heavily on human outcome data, but we didn't, and your comments were very inspiring, so thank you. But I did get legit pushback on a number of things, like why didn't I acknowledge that olive oil is a fruit oil? What about the omega-6-3 ratio? What about heating the oils and processing and bleaching? What about omega-3 supplements and personal things like how I looked as Mary Poppins and how I could never be seen by the world without my shirt on? So in this episode, I'll address as many questions from the comment section as I can. But for your sake, don't watch it all the way to the end. First question from Morphopolis. The fact that you don't know or pretend that you don't know that olive oil is not a seed oil but a fruit oil makes me believe this whole video is disingenuous. It's a good point, and I have to admit I threw up in my mouth a little bit every time I tried to choke out the term seeds candies. No, seed oil. I just think the term is so unclear, but I was trying to be respectful to the community who have concerns about oils because they feel very strongly about it.
Now, we call these cooking oils vegetable oils, okay? And that's a very euphemistic term because considering the fact that it's a lie.
You know, I always wonder about what PR room came up with the word vegetable oil. They're not made from vegetable oils. Vegetables, like broccoli or anything, they're made from seeds and beans. So there's actually should be called seed oils.
So they're not vegetable oils, they're seed oils.
I don't know what PR room came up with it either, but I thought it was pretty clear because we've been using it for so many centuries. For some reason, I have an unnatural interest in historical books about human health. And here's a fascinating one from 1655. Health's Improvement, or Rules Comprising and Discovering the Nature, Method, and Manner of Preparing All Sorts of Foods Used in this Nation. Written by that ever-famous Thomas Moffat, doctor in physics. He noted that all our food consists of animal or vegetable substances, salt alone excepted. When I was a teen and we played the game 20 Questions, where you had to think of what someone was saying in 20 questions or less, my opening question was always, is it animal, vegetable, or mineral? And everyone understood. When the ever-famous Thomas Moffat used the term vegetable oil, it was in context like this. To this class also belong volatile alkaline salts united by repeat sublimations with an aromatic vegetable oil. Take the purest salt of hartshorn an ounce, chemical oil of lemons a dram, unite them by repeated sublimations in a tall glass vessel. It never occurred to me that the ever-famous Dr. Moffat was lying or had hired a PR firm to refer to lemon oil as a vegetable oil. By the way, if you're wondering why I'm nutcase enough to read health books from the 1600s, one reason is the modern interest people have in ancestral diets. A topic of the day when this was published was how the nutrition of tame animals compared to wild ones. And here's a partial list of the great variety they were eating. Compare that to our present monoculture of Frankenchicken. And it's the same story for the amazing variety of furry creatures they were eating compared to our modern, nearly monoculture beef diet. There's a great book called Burn by a paleoanthropologist who makes clear how dramatically different the modern diets that we call ancestral are from hunter-gatherer diets. He says the authors of our modern ancestral diets should definitely have consulted paleoanthropologists. Although, I guess lab-grown tiger steaks, lion burgers, and zebra sushi are coming to a market near you. Brace yourself for a whole new genre of diet books and shredded shirtless bodies to promote fake real tiger protein. Fake real? Back to the term seed oils. Ugh. From what I can tell, creating that term just injected more confusion into an already too large swamp of confusing terms. I tried to avoid that whole swamp in my last episode, but if we're going to talk about omega-6 to omega-3 ratios, I guess we better define our terms. The reason I think the term seed oils is so confusing to everyday consumers is consumers don't refer to nuts, legumes, and grains as seeds. They don't ask for seed and rice burritos or seed and seed burritos, and the headlines they see cast a wide net that seed oils are very bad. So an everyday consumer asks, is coconut a fruit, nut, or seed? And when they Google it, the answer they get is yes. And some people say that despite the headlines, not all seed oils are bad. You have to know which ones they're referring to. Kraft Zion said, "Only 3 minutes in and I see you're dancing around the oils in question, already headed down the misinformation pathway, talking about olive oil and sesame oil like anyone has objections to them. Let me spell it out: cottonseed oil, canola oil, corn oil, and vegetable oil." But I was seeing sesame oil on plenty of bad oil lists.
And I'm going to get right to the point today. Basically, stop eating these vegetable and seed oils, such as soybean and canola oil, corn oil, cottonseed, sunflower, peanut oil, sesame oil, and even rice bran oil.
And I saw a lot of concerns about olive oil too.
Olive oil is not all it's cracked up to be. See, olive oil has a little bit higher of an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, but it's also not as easily assimilated by the body. So when you're leaning towards a monounsaturated fat, try to go for something like the macadamia nut oil.
When I cook, I prefer cook with grapeseed oil than olive oil. If I need to make marinade or dressing, without hesitation, I will take olive oil. But to sear a steak or something like that really high, if I don't have a barbecue and I need a little bit oil, I will take the grapeseed oil.
You notice by the end of the last episode, I was referring to the oils as liquid oils, and I like that term for 3 reasons. 1, consumers can understand it. If it's liquid at room temperature, it's a liquid oil, as opposed to ones that are solid, like lard, butter, coconut, and palm oils. 2, it includes some important oils like algal and fish oils. And 3, it speaks to saturation, which I think is the most important thing. Which brings up the question, what even is saturation in these oils? No worries, it's simple like H2O, so no need to glaze over when I show a simple diagram of a saturated fat molecule. It's a chain of carbon and hydrogen where each carbon atom is bonded once to its carbon neighbor. You know, like when you were line dancing and you grabbed the person's hand in front of you and the person's hand behind. And each carbon has 2 hydrogen, like when you had a child clinging to each leg when you were trying to line dance. That's the simple structure of coconut oil, completely saturated with hydrogen. You wouldn't think this would make much difference, but if 2 hydrogens go missing, then in the game of musical chairs molecules play, 2 carbons up their commitment to each other by bonding with 2 arms instead of 1. If that happens once in the chain, it's monounsaturated. Think olive oil. If it happens more than once, it's polyunsaturated. Think corn oil, or as some people say, a PUFA, short for polyunsaturated, but with added confusion. So olive oil would be a MUFA. Wondering Wanderer said this video didn't actually address the problems of seed oils. A better video would be to compare polyunsaturated fats, PUFAs, monosaturated fats, MUFAs, and saturated fats to health outcomes both acutely and long-term. Great suggestion. Walter Willett brings a ton of data to the table about this, partly because of his years at Harvard running huge studies.
Most of what we consume in the United States is unhealthy carbohydrates. That's the major part. That half our calories are from carbohydrates. Most of that is refined starch and sugar. So it's a very different question comparing saturated fat to those calories than, say, something specific like polyunsaturated fat or monounsaturated fat. This is what we published a few years ago looking at type of fat in the diet in relationship with coronary heart disease, comparing each type of fat with the same number of calories from carbohydrate. And as you can see, trans fat was by far the worst. Saturated fat was very weakly related to risk of heart disease compared to the same number of calories from carbohydrate. But monounsaturated fat, and even more so polyunsaturated fat, were related to lower risk of coronary heart disease.
Here's another chart of Walter's.
Here we're looking at the ratio of polyunsaturated fat to saturated fat. And we've known for many decades, 50, 60 years, that higher intake of polyunsaturates reduce LDL, the bad cholesterol in our blood, and higher intake of saturated fats increase the levels of LDL in our blood. So that ratio of polyunsaturated to saturated fat is a very long-standing way to evaluate the quality of fats in foods or overall diets. And beef has very little polyunsaturated fat in it and quite a bit of saturated fat. And so that ratio is really extremely low for beef. Chicken has a lot more polyunsaturates. That looks a lot better than compared to beef, but salmon's even better. And there's a huge difference with these plant-based sources of protein.
In terms of long-term health, the shortest life expectancies are associated with the left side of that chart and the longest to the right. So do these guys remind anybody of Twitter trolls arguing about seed oils? Kent Purdy said, the biggest surprise of this take is the lack of difference in health between omega-3 and 6 oils. This is different than what I've been reading for decades. Yeah, I still remember a talk Michael Greger gave about that 20 years ago when he had more hair that has since gone viral on the internet.
Up until 100 years ago, we've been eating about roughly equal amounts of omega-3s and omega-6s. So we've had an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of about 1-to-1 or 1.
That talk got me wondering what omega-3, 6, and 9 really mean, and why are the ratios so magical? Bill Harris is very respected by scientists for his 40 years of doing science on omega-3s. Here's how he thinks about the ratio.
Now, this whole thought that the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio is so important, everyone's so concerned about eating too much omega-6, which, the dietary sources, major dietary sources these days are vegetable oils, refined oils, but, getting them through. And then people have become scared about getting them through whole foods, like eating nuts and flaxseed and healthy food. Yeah. So what do you think? What are your thoughts on this index?
Well, I agree. I mean, the ratio, the concept makes some sense. It's very imprecise. Because when you say omega-3, you don't know what you're talking about, ALA, EPA, or DHA. It could be any of them. And when you say omega-6, you don't really know. There's 7 omega-6 fatty acids in the blood. Which ones are you talking about? And so you don't know what this ratio, you can't act upon it because you don't know what you're acting upon. The other problem is you can have a high omega-3 intake and a high omega-6 intake, or low omega-6 and a low omega-3 and have the same ratio. So that doesn't help because the problem is that you can fix a bad ratio by taking more omega-3, and that's the right way to do it. But you cannot fix it and improve your health by leaving your omega-3 intake alone and just lowering your omega-6, which that ratio people tend to do that. They think, well, I got to fix it. Well, the way to fix it, there's only one way to fix it. It's a good way to fix it. It's to eat more EPA, DHA. That's fine. If you want to play that ratio game and fix it that way, okay. But don't take it any further than that.
100% agree with you. That's my thoughts. Is that really it's the low omega-3 intake that's the problem, and that you need to increase that omega-3 intake.
I mean, we published 2 papers with this consortium of the 17 or 20 cohorts. We've had several other papers, all looking at fatty acids and some outcome. And one of them looked at linoleic acid levels in the blood and cardiovascular outcomes, and found that the higher the linoleic acid, the lower the risk for cardiovascular disease. And another paper looked at linoleic acid levels and risk for developing diabetes. Higher omega-6, linoleic, lower risk for developing diabetes. So when you look at that kind of data, when you're talking about a biomarker, it's not a dietary intake questionnaire thing that everybody questions. You're looking at a biomarker of omega-6 intake, linoleic acid. You can't make it. And higher levels are associated with lower cardiovascular and diabetic risk. It's hard to say they're bad.
Right.
I mean, you could turn that around and say lowering your levels of linoleic is going to increase your risk for atherosclerosis. And
So there's several omega-3s, and he only mentioned supplementing with 2 of them, and there's 7 omega-6s. And what are the differences between omega-3s and omega-6s? Well, alpha means beginning and omega means end, the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. Fats are long chains with a beginning and an end. So if the first carbon double bond is 3 carbons from the end, that's an omega-3. If 6 from the end, that's an omega-6. Good to know. You wouldn't think that would make such a big difference, but it does. They're both polyunsaturated fats, and that's why I was careful to enunciate the first carbon bond. I get the feeling that in the language of the internet, many people are referring to omega-6s when they say PUFAs. But to scientists, they're all PUFAs. Scientists aren't too good at naming things, so they decided naming them after the Greek alphabet wasn't obscure enough. So some scientists decided to call them N-3 or N-6 fats. Same thing, but with added confusion. So why do scientists refer to them as fatty acids when talking to consumers instead of just fats? I think it's because they haven't read the book Insanely Simple, a truly great book. I lived this book because I worked for Steve Jobs and I knew these authors. I told a story about one of my adventures with Steve in a TEDx talk. So why did Bill only talk about supplementing with DHA and EPA even though he mentioned ALA?
Omega-3 fatty acids, there's 3 of them. Most of the time I'm focused when I think about my enthusiasm for omega-3, I think about the marine sources.
yes.
Of EPA and DHA, but there's another source, ALA.
So we generally put them in 2 camps. There's the plant-based omega-3s, alpha-linolenic acid, ALA, is the 18-carbon omega-3 compared to the 20 or 22 carbon long marine omega-3s, EPA and DHA. And they are all in the same chemical family, but they are not, it's like, 3rd and 4th cousins. ALA has not got the cardioprotective benefits of EPA and DHA.
What do you think the best source of the omega-3s would be for someone who is a vegetarian or a vegan?
Vegetarian or vegan would be an algal oil. The original source of EPA and DHA in fish is not that they make omega-3. They don't really make omega-3 any better than we do, or make EPA and DHA. They eat preformed EPA and DHA when it comes from their food sources, which at the bottom of the food chain is these single-celled microalgae. And I'm not talking about seaweed, but these little organisms that convert sunlight into fatty acids, some of which are omega-3. And so different companies have identified which specific strains of algae, microalgae, will make DHA or EPA or both. And they've commercialized or they industrialized it and they harvest the oil. It's an expensive process at this point.
So the vegan argument is the body can convert ALA, which comes from land plants like flax seeds, to EPA and DHA, which comes from algae. The concern is, does your body convert enough to get optimal levels, and does the conversion depend on your heredity, state of health, and, for example, how much omega-6 fats you eat? And how would you know?
People very often confuse those 2 sources. They think they'll list good sources of omega-3. They'll say salmon and sardines, then they'll say chia seeds and black walnuts, and just throw it all in together, and it's very misleading because the plant-based omega-3s are not nearly as potent.
ALA gets converted into EPA in the body, correct?
And can be, yes.
It can be. The conversion of ALA into EPA and DHA there's huge inter-individual variation.
The thing about Bill is, in addition to being a professor doing A-level research, he and his PhD daughter Christina started an important company called Omega Quant. You go online, order a test kit like I did, put a drop of blood in the kit, and get a report of omega-3s in your blood. They assign a number to it and call it your omega-3 index.
So you very recently published a study that correlated the omega-3 index to all-cause mortality.
Right.
Was able to even predict mortality.
Right. It's going to be probably one of my capstone studies, I think, in hindsight. It was a collaboration among 17 different cohorts, like the Framingham studies, a cohort, Women's Health Initiatives cohort, MESA, EPIC. These are all, and from all around the world. These are groups that have been recruited at one point in time, blood samples taken, fatty acid levels measured in that blood. And then the investigators just follow this group of people over time to see what happens, what kind of diseases they get, who dies, who doesn't. So we looked basically between age 65 and 75, who died in that window of time. And we found that the people that had the highest omega-3 levels compared to the lowest were 15% or so less likely to die over that time. And it was when you look at quintiles of omega-3, it was very dose dependent. The higher the omega-3, the lower the risk.
Bill Harris often warns that vegans average an omega-3 index of 3.5, and the optimal level for longevity is 8 or above. A lot of people swimming out in that cold ocean water. Who's an idiot enough to do that? I did the Escape from Alcatraz triathlon a few times, and as we were getting set to plunge in the water, the race organizers would joke, many are cold, but few are frozen. Remember in the last episode how we saw that the 9,000 vegans were not like the other vegetarians and the pescatarians? They ate a lot more fruits and vegetables for one thing, and so their outcomes were much better in these metrics.
This is all data from Adventist Health Study 2. And you can see on the left, for average height females, it's kind of like a step ladder. And the vegans are certainly much lighter than others for the same height. When it comes to hypertension, and again, you can see that same progression from vegans up through non-vegetarians. If we turn now to diabetes, another common risk factor for cardiovascular disease and a number of other diseases, you can see again there's a threefold at least difference in risk.
So of course you would expect them to outlive the others, right? Right?
Do vegans do better than other vegetarians? I hesitate to go here, but let's try. Overall, from our data, the answer is no, if you're willing to look at total mortality, which some will say is only part of the picture, and it probably is. Morbidity is important. Vegans do have less cardiovascular disease, less cancer of the breast and prostate. Of the various vegetarian patterns, interestingly, it's the pesco vegetarians that actually have the lowest mortality, although it's unclear yet whether this is due to the fish.
I don't understand why, if they're dying at lower rates of cancer and heart disease, they don't live longer, but I hope to interview Dr. Fraser and find out. That's a pretty cool wheel, huh? The usual two suspects are vegans are not always diligent about supplementing with B12, and maybe they're missing out on the marine sources of omega-3s because they don't eat fish.
Because fish is disgusting. How bored are you with eating if you're ordering the fish? Just bring me something gross. I like to waste money.
Robbie Barbero is a very disciplined vegan who eats a lot of fruit and no oils. So let's see what his Omega Quant results were.
So there's a lot to look at here, but we're just going to do really quickly. So here's this stuff called ALA, the omega-3 essential fat. Our body cannot make it. We absolutely need it. It's absolutely essential. Well, he's getting some of that from his greens and from his fruit and maybe a few chia seeds here and there. He's in good shape. So then the big question is, can the body make this stuff EPA and this stuff DHA out of this stuff ALA?
So young and healthy Robbie is above 8, but what about the rest of us who don't eat fish? It's hard to know without having test results, so we're seeing a lot of recommendations to supplement with marine sources of omega-3 for insurance.
The problem is that people who don't eat fish may be under 4.4. Nearly 2/3 of vegans may fall below 4, suggesting a substantial number of vegans have an omega-3 status associated with accelerated brain aging. The average American just exceeds the threshold at about 4.5, though if you age and gender match for the vegans, ironically, the omnivores did just as bad. There's not a lot of long chains in Big Macs either. But having a nutrient status no worse than those eating a standard American diet is not saying much. And so that's why I recommend everyone eat a plant-based diet along with contaminant-free EPA and DHA to get the best of both worlds, omega-3 levels associated with brain preservation while minimizing exposure to toxic pollutants.
There have been a lot of omega-3 supplementation studies that have produced mixed results. And the question became, what if the dose wasn't big enough? After all, the dose you get in a supplement is usually much less than a single gram.
That's what's predominantly been studied, low doses of mixtures of EPA or DHA.
My mother and grandmother, both organic chemists, made sure I had a teaspoon of cod liver oil every day growing up, which is almost 5 grams. Yuck.
Maybe part of the reason prior trials of omega-3 fatty acids were negative was in part they used lower doses.
And that led to 2 absolutely fascinating studies of omega-3 supplementation.
So what I'm going to speak about today is the Reduce It trial. So the overall design is shown here. Patients about 8,000 plus with established cardiovascular disease in 70% of the population. Patients were followed for several years, up to 6.2 years. The randomization was 4 grams a day of icosapent-ethyl.
Icosapent-ethyl is a prescription drug where they've stripped out every component of fish oil but EPA. Why just EPA? Because EPA is thought to be the omega-3 for the heart. DHA is for the brain. This was a heart study. Here's why he didn't use an over-the-counter supplement.
This is work from Preston Mason, a colleague of mine from Harvard Medical School. He's a basic researcher. But this was an interesting analysis he did looking at the fatty acid content of the leading U.S. fish oil supplement. And you've got to take my word that it's the leading U.S. fish oil supplement. I know what it is, but he won't let us say what it is because he's afraid he might get sued by that company. So it's the leading U.S. fish oil supplement. He took a look at what's actually in there. And there is some EPA in there in red and DHA in purple. So, you know, that's presumably why people are buying it, because they're thinking they're getting omega-3 fatty acids. But there's a bunch of saturated fat there and a bunch of other fats in there too. So that's the problem.
The control group got a placebo of mineral oil because it was considered inert. I thought you couldn't find a better designed study with a more talented team. The scientist and cardiologist in the clips you just heard is Deepak Bhatt, a professor at Harvard who's deeply respected by other scientists. And the results were spectacular.
Events reduced by icosapent-ethyl versus placebo from 28% to 23%. It's a hazard ratio of 0.75, a relative risk reduction of 25% or so. And death from cardiovascular causes significantly reduced by 20%.
You almost never see a trial that is considered medical practice changing like this one. Absolute home run, right? The great thing about science is you trust in God but tie your horse.
In parallel, we did a 13,000 patient trial called Strength.
The Strength study gave the same 4-gram dose of purified omega-3s, but this time it was a mixture of EPA and DHA. And instead of a mineral oil, they used corn oil as the placebo. So if you're concerned about seed oil toxicity, this trial would be very important, because giving the control group 4 grams of corn oil per day over years in a trial involving 13,000 people should suss out how toxic it is, right? And to many people's shock, the trial was stopped early because essentially the corn oil outperformed the omega-3s. Wait, what? There was no difference between omega-3s in corn oil and coronary events, but the omega-3s had some undesirable side effects like longer bleed times, gastrointestinal distress, and some AFib. The corn oil didn't. So what is the explanation? Here's what Dr. Neeson said, who's at the Cleveland Clinic and was in charge of the trial.
When we were designing Strength, we knew that we needed to have a placebo that would appear identical, but that would have no effects. And after much discussion, we used corn oil. And what you'll see is that the corn oil group, there was no effect on any of the lipid or inflammatory biomarkers. If you then compare Strength and Reduce It, you see an absolutely stunning finding. In Reduce It, C-reactive protein in the control group, which used mineral oil, C-reactive protein went up over 30%. LDL went up. ApoB went up. And so we think that Strength demonstrates fairly clearly that Reduce It is a false positive study. That what you really are seeing is the adverse effects of mineral oil and not the favorable effects of purified EPA.
If you distrust science, you can look at the Reduce It trial and say, see, science is often wrong. If you're like me and you think science is the best way of knowing in the long term, you can say, see, science is self-correcting. Here's what a science YouTuber I greatly admire says.
As flawed as our science may be, it is far and away more reliable than any other way of knowing that we have.
Dr. Christina Jacksonville's daughter says maybe this is telling us that omega-3s are best used as supplements in modest doses, not as pharmaceuticals in high doses.
Omega-3s are blessed and cursed because they are seen as both a drug and a nutrient because of the pretty powerful nutritional studies. We kept pushing them more into the drug realm. Omega-3s might not be good drugs, but does that mean that omega-3s are not an important nutrient? I don't think so.
So what do I take away from all this? Well, I haven't spent my life studying omega-3s like Bill and Christina have, so I'm taking their advice to get my levels checked. I've also taken Dr. Greger's advice to take 250 milligrams of a combination of DHA and EPA in algal form. Hopefully I'll get my OmegaQuant results in a couple of days and can include them in this episode. By the way, as I was listening to leading cardiologists debating these studies, I wondered what they thought of edible fats. Here's Dr. Neil Stone, who has a very high profile as a lipid expert.
I saw a lady in the office, though, the other day. It was 2 years ago. Her LDL was 230, and on repeat it was 220. And I asked my fellow, what would you like to give her? He said, 80 of atorvastatin, Dr. Stone. I said, let's take a nutritional history. She was on this crazy diet, coconut oil, hardly any carbohydrates, just lots of fat, high-fat dairy, fatty cuts of red meat. I said, why don't we just see for 3 months, since there's no family history of high cholesterol, no family history of premature heart disease, let's see what happens when we put you on a Mediterranean-style diet, where we talk about good fats like extra virgin olive oil, canola oil, try to avoid the bad fats and try to avoid the bad carbs like sugar, but have plenty of fruits and vegetables and whole grains. Her LDL fell to 140, but I said, why don't we come back in 6 months? It fell to 130. Why don't you come back in a year? It fell to 120. And I turned to the fellow and I said, how much atorvastatin do you want to give her? He said, I think we'll pass on this one, Dr. Stone. I said, good call.
Flyspleen said, one question, has processing of seed oils always been so extreme? What shocked me in What I've Learned's video is the ultra-processing. We know ultra-processing results in food that seems to be harmful. So basically, I'm wondering if seed oils are bad nowadays because of the processing. Thanks. Great question. Stefan Goyenet, a scientist I admire, wrote, one of the most valuable heuristics in nutrition is also one of the simplest. Eat minimally refined foods. I have long been suspicious of oils for this very reason because they seem very refined. But even I, the guy who is so down on processed foods, has to admit that the human outcome studies don't back up what seems so intuitively obvious and scary to most of us, that these are really refined foods. As we saw from the strength trial, a daily dose of 4 grams of corn oil had no detectable negative effects, at least over the course of a few years. In the large and very long-term Harvard studies, the liquid oils looked very good when they replaced saturated fat or they replaced white flour and sugar. But of course not when they're combined with white flour and sugar to make donuts. The one proviso is there are very respected doctors who care for the acutely ill in heart disease, diabetes, dementia, and they don't like their acutely ill patients eating oils, and I have to respect that. Kirkir wrote a related question. For me, any oil that uses hexane or other chemicals during processing isn't something I want in my body. I agree with you, and with hexane being so common in cleaning fluids, gasoline, glues, inks, etc., we should all use a lot of caution. But it's a highly volatile liquid, and that's why we breathe so much of it when we fill our cars with gas, and that's why there's so little of it left in edible oils after the refining process. Dr. Crosby tackled this question on Harvard's site. It has been estimated that refined vegetable oils extracted with hexane contain approximately 0.8 milligrams of residual hexane per kilogram. That's less than 1 part per million. It's also estimated that the level of ingestion of hexane from all food sources is less than 2% of the daily intake from all other sources, primarily gasoline fumes. So there appears to be very little reason for concern about the trace levels of hexane in canola oil, for example. Hexane is on the red list, and the EU has very strict limits of less than 1 part per million in edible oil. In Iran, scientists bought 23 different oils in the store and didn't find any that exceeded that standard. By contrast, OSHA allows up to 500 parts per million of hexane in the air at your workplace, and you breathe that all day long. Sheesh, it sounds like I'm defending oils when I've been suspicious of them for so long and I consume so little of them. But we have to be honest about the data we're seeing. And that brings me to comments like Stefan Finn's. I hoped you would bring up more points made by the gentleman at the beginning of the video, Chris Kenobi. I watched the lecture and found it to be somewhat convincing of the fact that seed oils play a huge part in our modern problems, especially with his points about no or near zero registered cases of heart disease before we got flooded with processed foods and oils. I watched that lecture too and read one of his books, The Omega-6 Apocalypse, And he does speak with great conviction. The University of Minnesota has a wonderful essay about the history of heart attacks in previous centuries. The bottom line is the symptoms were common, but they didn't know what it was until the 1920s. And extensive MRI scans of mummies from around the world have shown heart disease was always common in around 30% of every population tested. The most relevant thing, though, is now that we've collected such vast amounts of data over the last 70 years when the oils have been around, is do they cause or prevent such things as heart attacks? And the studies are as clear as they can be. The liquid oils, all of them, reduce heart attacks when they replace saturated fats or when they replace white flour and refined sugar. Chris Kenobi is joined by at least a dozen like-minded doctors, and every time I listen to them, I hear these astounding claims, like Chris Kenobi's claim that French fries are worse than smoking.
But he wrote a great book. I think you'd totally geek out with him. It's called The PEO Solution. And I said, Professor Peskin, what's worse, smoking cigarettes or these vegetable oils? And I know you've had this conversation before with Dave Asprey and others. He said if somebody smoked 2 packs of cigarettes every single day for about 28 years, their chances of developing lung cancer is about 16%, according to his research. And then he said if somebody ate these cooked vegetable oils, these toxic 8, hateful 8, for every single day for up to 28 years, their chances of developing a cancer and or heart disease was about 86%. So how does that line up with your research?
Yeah, I would say it's probably close. If you include other diseases that you don't want, like Alzheimer's and autoimmune diseases, we're approaching 100.
But the omega-3s increase your metabolic rate, increase your oxygen metabolism. They give, when you take the right kind and the right amount, they will give you 40 to 60% increase in stamina in whatever is your sport of preference.
When I hear astonishing claims like those, I always want to see the data, but I've never been able to track down the data that backs up those claims. They often put up a chart showing the trend in obesity, saying seed oils did this to us. But other people blame the obesity crisis on sugar or activity level. Stéphane Gouyenet even produced this chart as a joke, saying you could even blame the obesity crisis on low-carb diet books. The only one who has done A-level science about food and weight gain and has convincing data that I know of is Kevin Hall from the National Institutes of Health.
There had never been a randomized controlled trial to investigate any aspect of ultra-processed foods. What we were focused on, because my lab is primarily interested in obesity, is to ask the question of if you were to provide people with exposure to these foods in a controlled setting. We had these people come in and stay with us for 28 days continuously, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and exposed them to all of their food and measured every morsel of food that they ate over the entire 28-day period. And in random order, we assigned them to 2 weeks of the ultra-processed diet, followed immediately by 2 weeks of the unprocessed diet, or vice versa. And the question that we were interested in was, did these folks, when they're given very simple instructions, just eat as much or as little as they want, did they have any difference in calorie intake? Here's the day-to-day energy intake, average energy intake of the folks, these same folks, again in random order, exposed to the ultra-processed diet compared to the unprocessed diet. There was about an average of 508 calories a day different between these two diets.
In that context, I really understand the concern about seed oils. We've known for a very long time that combining sugar, salt, and fat to make processed food is a toxic cocktail. But not using moderate amounts of oil in an otherwise healthy diet, like using them for salad dressing. In the last episode, I quoted Stéphane Gouyenet as saying the case against seed oils has largely collapsed. And someone pointed out that he was talking about obesity, not toxicity, and that Udo explains toxicity well. It's also known that fats get severely modified when heated, etc., and refining them heats them up many times. And Udo also explains how bleaching, etc., modifies them even further.
And that oil has been treated with Drano window washing acid, bleached and fried before it went in the bottle.
Ugh, it hurts my soul to think how many views talks like that get. Drano has lye, L-Y-E, and windshield washing fluid has methanol, a poisonous alcohol. Neither are used in processing edible oils. The bleaching of oils refers to removing color through filtration, not by using the chemical bleach that Drano has in it. Yes, you can oxidize some oils by heating them too high and watch them turn brown, kind of like this apple is oxidizing and going brown that I'm eating. But it's nothing like the oxidation that comes from grilling a steak or chicken. But if you're worried about it, you can cook with an oil like avocado or canola with high smoke points. Just be aware the food you're cooking inside the oil will probably oxidize at a much lower temperature than the oil will. I've seen a dozen videos saying coconut oil has a high smoke point because it's saturated. But my understanding is virgin unrefined coconut oil has a 350-degree smoke point, and the refined version goes up to 450. Generally, the more refining, the higher the smoke point, because refining removes things that oxidize, which are often beneficial nutrients. Yes, repeatedly heating oil to high temperatures in commercial fryers, where the oil takes on oxidized food of various kinds, does gradually alter the oil. But that's easy to study, and the effects haven't been dramatic, not even in the same universe as flame broiling beef or grilling chicken. I'll provide some links in the description. I sometimes get asked why I haven't debated people in the anti-seed oil camp. I view my role as not to pretend that I'm in the same pay grade as doctors and scientists who devoted their lives to this. My mission is to uncover what the best scientists have discovered and present it in a way that hopefully consumers can understand. But like you, I'm very interested in what a debate like that would look like, and it's our lucky day, because I noticed that Matthew Negra, who's above my pay grade, did a 4-hour debate with Tucker Goodrich, moderated by Simon Hill.
A 35% reduction in risk of all-cause mortality and a 33% reduction in risk of fatal atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease is a small benefit.
Well, it also showed a large increase in cancer in the intervention group towards the end of it, right?
So that's
you don't get to just ignore that.
Okay.
Why did you do it?
It's something that I think needs to be addressed, and what better way to address it than by actually challenging the views of one of the more prominent people in that space.
What did you learn from the 4 hours?
As far as content, it was 100% during preparation where I really learned about the specifics, like how good the data is for vegetable oil consumption, especially when compared to the saturated fats, because it is very strong data.
So Chris, you ask, why are some doctors on social media so convinced oils are toxic and the experts in the field pay no attention to them?
I don't know that anyone's arguing over like olive oil versus canola oil. Like there's a canola oil. Like,
they are.
Well, no, what
they definitely are.
What I'm getting at is that I don't know that like people in academia are arguing about this.
Right.
I think people who are like big seed oil, like,
conspiracy
folks,
theorists.
100%. Those are the people who are irrelevant because they make up, very small proportion, but very vocal, mind you. So from a social learning perspective. So what I'm getting at is like actual professionals and experts in the field are not arguing about this.
Gil Carvalho gave a masterclass in one of his YouTube videos about logical leaps in science, where you make observations like oils get exposed to hexane, they change composition if you heat them too much, we're eating a lot more of them than we used to, and you make the logical leap that they harm human health. It's very intuitive, but this is why real scientists do real experiments. If I hadn't seen the results of some of these big, well-run studies, I never would have believed that oil could be healthy in some contexts. Don't Pass Silver said, it would be interesting to see if a diet which contains some oils is superior or not to a diet which avoids all oils. It sure would. I'm not aware of a study like that, but if someone knows of one, I'd be fascinated. But I'm willing to bet it depends on what the oil is compared to. If compared to nuts and legumes and veggies and fruits and whole grains, my bet is oils would lose. But we do have very solid data to compare liquid oils to butter and lard and coconut and palm oils, and oils crush them. Grimy Honky Racing said, and you look pretty good in lipstick. Why, thank you. Nancy Stueve said, the most shocking takeaway from this video is how attractive Chris McCaskill is dressed as Mary Poppins. I have to call out gross misinformation when I see it, and I think I know what Dr. Ken Berry would say about that comment.
It's a lie.
Why are you still here? Go watch some nutrition videos on Gil Carvalho's channel. He's great. You don't want to see this next bit. One commenter said, congratulations, you made the malnourished 8 list. That sounds like a great accomplishment for a guy whose BMI is 23, has podiumed in many Ironman competitions, has never shown a nutrient deficiency in a blood test, and is on no medications, right? I like endurance sports, and you can't be fast if you're carrying bulk, and the coaches are always pestering you to get lighter. We endurance athletes are used to weightlifters saying we don't look man enough, am I right? But hey, if you want to see muscular vegans, you can check out Simon Hill, Nimai Delgado, and dozens of others. Another guy said, you could never take your shirt off, and I'm only willing to take nutritional advice from people who are willing to show what they got. But you're right, I couldn't strut my stuff on the socials right now because I got 4 grandkids in high school, and can you imagine their friends coming up to them and saying, ooh, you got a grandpa who's off doing that on YouTube? The young grandkids did like the Tooth Fairy gig though, But I can tell a story about the one that got away. I have a friend who's motorcycling through Africa, and he bought me this. Very nice gift. I wasn't sure how you attach that, but obviously a loincloth, right? And I thought, well, to thank him, I'll just sneak out on my wife's scooter, sit there for just enough time to take a photo and send it to him privately. When my wife saw me do that in front of the house on her scooter, even briefly, she said, "Chris, you get back in here right now." Yeah, well, that's not how they wear those in Africa. And so he printed an 8x10 and took it to every African village, to the hilarity of the villagers. But of course, my friend made sure it went public and humiliated everyone. My 3 sons even hacked my wife's phone so she can't forget it. Ironically, when I was answering the malnourishment question, this photo of Lester Wright popped up in my feed, and I thought, uh-oh, he's so trim, some people are going to get the impression he's malnourished.
Right here from the Shore Athletic Club, our boy, Lester Wright, who is 100 years old.
But when he brought the whole stadium to their feet by breaking the world record in the 100-meter dash for men over 100 years old, he looked well enough nourished to my eyes. He credited his strictly regimented diet, like alternating cream of wheat and oatmeal each day. Looks like in his case, grains didn't turn out to be the poison the internet thinks they are.
Grandpa, you said you never tested low on nutrient, and you just did. You're malnourished, Grandpa. You're gonna need a bigger dose, Grandpa.
It's true, I'm a 6, and if you think the omega index is legit, that means I just got a D. That despite supplementing at Dr. Greger's recommended rate and eating a tablespoon of ground flax, chia, or hemp seeds every day and eating all the other omega-3 rich foods aside from fish. As a former earth scientist, I can't bring myself to eat fish. Few of us can because we know what we're doing to the oceans. How could I ace DHA but EPA was a fail? What's wrong with my body that can't even absorb EPA from supplements? Is Dr. Greger's recommended dose too lame for me? After all, just a 3-ounce portion of farm salmon supposedly gives you 1,240 milligrams of DHA and 590 of EPA. So I went and grabbed a bottle of my supplements and found out I got faked out by the label. I read it too quickly as DHA and EPA, but in fact it's DHA and DPA, an omega-3 that we didn't talk about in this episode. There is no EPA in this bottle. So I went looking for an algal source that had significant EPA and couldn't believe all the DHA-only versions out there. Are there some economies of producing algal-based omegas I wasn't aware of that makes DHA only cheaper to produce? And as I investigated, I discovered that producing this stuff is complicated enough to blow your mind. Interestingly, Omega Quant chose a specific omega-6 and omega-3 to calculate a ratio. Arachidonic acid as the omega-6 and EPA as the omega-3. The concern in some circles is arachidonic acid in excess can be no bueno. But despite my lame EPA levels, I aced this one because the main sources of arachidonic acid are chicken, eggs, and beef, which I don't eat. Arachidonic acid is a long story, and this episode is already insanely long, and I've only gotten to half your questions, so... So you've been a sea captain for how long?
I was first a captain at 19 years old on San Francisco Bay.
And now you're trying to get your adorable grandson hooked on it.
I am working very hard to get my grandson addicted to sailing. Hey, Ollie, do you like ships?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Ollie's adorable.
Oh, thank you.